In this video, I'm going to go through these solutions to the IB Economics Higher Level Paper 1. This is the 2023 November paper. Okay, so in a previous video, I'd already gone through the solutions to question 1, and today I'll be doing question 2. So I'm looking at this guy over here. And there's two parts of this question, obviously A and B. In the first part of the question, part A, we've been asked to explain how changes in two determinants of investment could lead to an increase in real gross domestic product, or GDP. Okay, so without further ado, let's get stuck into it. Now, this question is about the aggregate demand and supply model. So if you're quite familiar with this model, then this question is for you. As usual, we're going to start off by looking at some key terms. Then we're going to draw a little diagram, in this case, the aggregate demand and supply curves. Next, we'll need a section to explain the theory and related concepts. And finally, we'll finish off with a little summary. The question doesn't specifically ask for any examples, so we can probably do without one. Okay, so let's begin. So in here, I've identified two key terms. These include investment and the real gross domestic product, or RGDP for short. I think these are probably just since the question is asking us to discuss how investment can lead to RGDP, I think these two terms are important for us to firstly define. Okay, let's look at that first one. So in terms of investment, investment refers to spending by firms on capital goods such as machinery, buildings, and technology, which are used to produce goods and services. Investment is a component of aggregate demand. And it also contributes to long-term economic growth by increasing the economy's productive capacity. Okay, so it's kind of what investment is. Basically, it's when we invest in things that make us in theory, it should make us more productive in the long run. So I'm thinking things like plant, equipment, machinery, infrastructure, all that sort of good stuff. Okay, so the second key term we probably need to define is this idea of RGDP. Real GDP measures the total value of all final goods and services produced within an economy, adjusted for inflation. It serves as a key indicator of economic performance and growth. Okay, so RGDP should be a familiar concept to you by now. Essentially sort of measures the total dollar value of all the stuff and things that we can make in an economy once we adjust for inflation. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Let's move on to the next bits. So next, we're going to need a little diagram. Probably give myself a little bit more space here. And this is a pretty standard aggregate demand, aggregate supply model I want to draw. So again, if you are familiar with this diagram, then it shouldn't be too difficult for you. So let's start off by drawing. Actually, you know what? Give myself a little bit more space here. Don't really want to crowd myself too much. Okay, there we go. All right, so for aggregate demand and supply, we instead of prices on the vertical axes, we're going to have some sort of measure of overall price and some sort of measure of overall price level. So we can say something like the price level, or something like CPI or inflation, just depending on what sort of price. I've got terrible handwriting. Price comes from years of not actually using a pen. And on the horizontal axes, we're going to have something like RGDP, as opposed to just sort of regular quantity. Then once we've done that, we can have our aggregate demand curve, which looks like a regular demand curve. We have our short run aggregate supply curve, which looks like a regular supply curve, which we'll abbreviate to SRAS. And we have a long run aggregate supply curve, or LRAS. And then we can indicate sort of like a growth in aggregate demand by how investment can improve these things kind of by a shift in SRAS or AD, and maybe we'll shift the LRAS as well. And so we can change an output, let's say from Y1, let's say Y1 to Y2, and the inflation level kind of we don't really know what happens to inflation depending on which effect is stronger, whether the supply side or the demand side sort of dominates. Okay, so pretty standard sort of aggregate demand and supply model. You could probably kind of do away with the red bits if you don't really want them, but yeah, it's just, this is a standard aggregate demand supply model. And of course, don't forget to annotate your diagram as well. So we want to just make clear that AD stands for aggregate demand, SRAS stands for short run aggregate supply, LRAS is long run aggregate supply, and RGDP is real gross domestic product. Okay, so let's add some commentary around this. In the monetarist new classical model, increased investment affects both aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply. Oh, shocking, terrible. Long-run aggregate supply. An increase in aggregate demand is shown by a rightward shift from AD1 to AD2. That was never going to work. AD1 to AD2. Leading to higher output in the short run, but higher inflationary pressure. Demand pool inflation. Right, so here we're just saying that if you increase aggregate demand, then you're gonna get some demand pull inflation. Well, if you do that, then on the supply side, over time, increased investment also raises the economy's productive capacity, shifting both SRAS and LRAS rightward from LRAS1 to LRAS2. Kind of sort of got there. LRAS1 to LRAS2. Resulting in higher real GDP and lower inflationary pressure. The combined effect is an increase in RGDP, but the impact on inflation is indeterminate depending on which effect, demand or supply, is stronger. Yeah, so essentially what we're saying here is that with investment, in the sort of the new classical model, if you increase investment levels, that's going to stimulate aggregate demand, and also as those investments come online, then our productive capacity improves in the long run, and obviously our long run aggregate supply curve is also going to shift. So graphically, we would depict this by an increase in aggregate demand from 81 to 82. Actually, I realized I've just made a boo-boo in this picture. I forgot to didn't really label that properly. Yeah, so all the curves will shift from version 1 to version 2, from the black lines to the red lines. And we're going to have this boost in output, and the effect on inflation is unclear because it depends on which effect is stronger. If the demand effect is stronger, then we can see that the aggregate demand curve is going to shift more than the long-run aggregate supply curve, and inflation is going to go up, and we call that demand pull inflation. But if the supply effect is stronger, then we're going to not have as much inflation, or the inflation level might actually come down, and I guess that's good news if you're a central banker. Okay, so let's move on to the next part of this question. So here we're going to sort of do a bit of theory and explanation. We're gonna answer the actual question. So we have to explain how two determinants of investment can increase our GDP. The most obvious ones that I can think of are interest rates and technology. Okay, so let's do the interest rate one first. Interest rates represent the cost of borrowing and the reward for saving. Lower interest rates reduce the cost of financing investment projects, encouraging firms to invest more in capital goods. Lower interest rates make loans for purchasing machinery or constructing factories more affordable. As investment spending increases, aggregate demand rises, shifting AD1 to AD2. That was not going to work. AD1 to AD2. Increased investment also raises the economy's stock of capital, enhancing productivity and shifting LRAS1 to LRAS2. Not bad, anyone goes there. For example, central banks reduce interest rates during economic downturns, such as the 2008 global financial crisis. This spurred business investment, aiding economic recovery. Right, so what we're saying is interest rates represent the cost of borrowing. So when interest rates are low, that actually reduces the cost of borrowing, which in turn encourages firms to invest more in things like capital, infrastructure, and stuff that generally improves our productive capacity in the long run. So when these investments come online, then we have a boost to our GDP. Now, the second sort of important sort of driver to investment I can think of is the impact of technology. Technological advancements often drive investment as firms adopt new and more efficient methods of production. Investing in technology not only enhances productivity, but also creates opportunities for innovation. As new technologies emerge, firms invest in upgrading equipment, software, and production processes to remain competitive. Increased investment in technology raises aggregate demand in the short run, shifting AD1 to AD2. In the long run, technological investments improve productivity and reduce production costs, expanding the economy's productive capacity and shifting LRAS1 to LRAS2. For example, the rise in automation and artificial intelligence has led many firms to invest heavily in robotics and software, boosting productivity across sectors such as manufacturing and logistics. For instance, e-commerce companies like Amazon have invested in automated warehouses, contributing to GDP growth through increased efficiency. So another important driver of economic growth is technology. This is pretty self-explanatory as better technology makes us more efficient at doing things, and this increased efficiency translates to productivity gains, which ultimately leads to economic growth and increased GDP. Now, the next section we're going to we're going to integrate some of that aggregate demand and supply model stuff. Investment spending directly increases aggregate demand. As it is a component of aggregate demand. Recall that so AD equals C plus I plus G plus NX. So this is our aggregate demand identity. In the Keynesian model, the short-run result is an increase in real GDP and possibly higher price levels depending on the economy's spare capacity. So that's the short-run impact. In the long run, investment adds to the economy's stock of physical capital, which is a factor of production. This boosts productivity and expands the economy's productive capacity, leading to a rightward shift in LRAS, or the Keynesian AS curve. The long-run effect is sustainable economic growth without excessive inflation. Yep, so that's the long-run effect of investment. And just to summarize, maybe I'll just check this down here. Makes it look a little bit neat. Changes in determinants of investment, such as lower interest rates and advancements in technology, can significantly influence real GDP by stimulating both aggregate demand and aggregate supply. I don't know why this thing never understands the word demand. Always thinks I'm saying man. Anyway. The short-run effects enhance output and employment. While the long-run effects improve productivity and potential GDP. Policymakers often target these determinants to drive economic growth, as demonstrated by real-world examples like fiscal incentives for technological innovation and central bank interest rate cuts. And there you have it. So yeah, I would think that that is a decentish response to this question. So if we kind of go back, yeah, I started off with a couple of key definitions, define a couple of key terms like investment and RGDP, which I think are important given that the question is asking us to explain how determinants of investment can increase our GDP. Then we sort of follow up with the standard sort of aggregate demand, aggregate supply model of the economy, and we sort of demonstrate how if the way investments work is that they're meant to stimulate or grow aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply. And down here, we've got a bit of theory and explanation as to how specifically the determinants of investment can increase GDP. So this occurs through interest rates and through improvements in technology, and then kind of finished off by integrating sort of aggregate demand and supply model effects. Okay, so I think that about does it for the first part of question 2. Let's move on to the second bit. Now, the second part of this question, part B, we've been asked to use real examples to discuss whether gross national income, GNI, is a useful measure of economic well-being. Right. So again, this question is pretty straightforward in terms of what it's asking us to do. We simply have to discuss whether GNI is a useful measure of economic well-being. Additionally, we've been instructed to use real-world examples, so we need to work those into the solution. As usual, we're going to begin with a section on key terms. Next, I don't think we really need a diagram, so we can skip that. But what we do need is a pretty big section on theory and explanation, and we definitely need a section discussing real-world examples, as the question specifically asks us to do that. All right, so let's start off by looking at a few key terms. So here I've identified 2. These include gross national income, or GNI for short, and maybe one for this idea of economic well-being, since we have been asked to sort of discuss economic well-being as well. So a couple of words: GNI and economic well-being. So in terms of the first keyword or key term, GNI measures the total income earned by a country's residents. Including domestic production, GDP, and net income from abroad, such as remittances and foreign investments. Remittances. It is calculated as GNI is equal to GDP, which is what the country produces, and you need to add to the net primary. You know what? I think this thing can handle it. Net primary income from abroad. Right. So GNI includes both domestic production, which is GDP, as well as whatever other net income that we earn from overseas. So let's say a country invests heavily in another country, and those investments begin to pay off, and that those earnings are sent back to the home country. Well, we need to include those measures in GNI as well as domestic production, which is GDP. So next up, we need to talk about this idea of economic well-being, and it refers to the overall quality of life and standard of living experienced by individuals in a country. It includes material wealth, income and consumption, as well as non-material factors such as health, education, environmental quality, and work-life balance. So often people sort of think of economic well-being as being synonymous with like GDP. So countries which have a higher GDP, higher GDP per capita tend to have better economic well-being. But I think nowadays we sort of understand that economic well-being doesn't only include physical and material wealth, things like what GDP would capture, but it also includes sort of these non-material factors as well. So things like your having a clean environment, work-life balance, all that other sort of good stuff as well that contributes to economic well-being, not just the physical stuff. So yes, we need to sort of recognize that. Okay, so the next bit here, we're going to talk about a bit of theory and explanation and how GNI measures economic well-being as well as limitations to that measure. So essentially some arguments for and against the use of GNI as a measure of economic well-being. So in the first section, we're going to discuss how GNI reflects economic well-being. GNI per capita is often used as an indicator of a country's economic well-being because higher incomes lead to higher standards of living. Countries with high GNI per capita tend to have better access to healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Furthermore, rising GNI can indicate growing job opportunities and improvements in living standards. Now, we're going to talk about some limitations to this, right? So in theory, GNI is having access to these physical, having access to all this sort of wealth and income is good, but there are some limitations. While GNI is a useful indicator, wow, this thing just butchered it completely. Okie dokie. While GNI is a useful indicator, it does not capture all aspects of well-being. Other considerations include so we need to think about things like income and equality, or specifically inequality. GNI per capita is an average measure and does not reflect income distribution. A country can have high GNI, but extreme inequality. For example, the United States has a high GNI per capita, but also significant income inequality, with wealth concentrated among the top 1%. That's one of the first shortcomings of GNI, is that it doesn't really tell us how income is distributed within a country. The second sort of disadvantage or shortcoming is that it doesn't really account for negative externalities, right? Things like pollution and all that sort of stuff. GNI does not account for negative externalities like pollution, environmental degradation, or social costs of economic growth. For example, China has experienced rapid GNI growth, but also severe environmental pollution, reducing quality of life. So yeah, so one of the other shortcomings of GNI is that it doesn't. There's no way for us to measure the impact of pollution and other sort of negative externalities. Another sort of limitation of GNI is that it doesn't really do a good job of capturing the informal economy or unpaid work. Many economic activities, such as unpaid household labor and informal work, are not captured in GNI statistics. In countries like India, a large portion of the workforce operates in the informal sector, meaning GNI underestimates actual economic contributions. So one of the problems of GNI is that, of course, if there's a lot of work that's taking place outside of official markets, they don't get captured or picked up in the official statistics. A couple other problems like composition of output. GNI measures total income, but does not indicate whether spending is on beneficial goods, education, healthcare, or harmful ones. Military expenditure. Countries with high GNI due to oil exports, like Saudi Arabia, may not necessarily have a diversified, sustainable economy. Yeah, so another shortcoming of GNI is that it doesn't really measure exactly what your economy is doing. It just measures the total dollar value of how much stuff and things is being produced. But if your country is sort of like mainly producing things like weapons or military equipment, well, yeah, one can argue that's not really contributing to contributing to social welfare. Or if you have a high concentration, like if you only focus on things like oil exports or one particular industry, you don't really have a diversified economy. One final sort of shortcoming of GNI is that it also doesn't take into account things like natural resource depletion. GNI does not account for the depletion of natural resources, which can artificially inflate income figures in the short run. Many African nations rely on resource extraction, but GNI figures do not reflect long-term sustainability. So, for example, if your country just primarily like digs things out of the ground, well, those things are going to run out at some point. So, yeah, if you could have a high GNI statistic in the short run, but when those non-renewable resources run out, then well, you don't really have anything to, again, your economy is not sufficiently well diversified to have a sustainable source of income in the long run. So next, we're going to propose some alternative measures of GNI, such as the OECD Better Life Index, World Happiness Index, and the Happy Planet Index. So we'll start off by looking at the OECD Better Life Index. Measures well-being based on income, housing, jobs, health, education, work-life balance, and environment. For example, Australia ranks highly due to strong social services and high life satisfaction. A bit of a plug for my home country. The second alternative measure of economic well-being is like this World Happiness Index, which uses factors like GDP per capita, social support, life expectancy, freedom, and corruption perception. For example, Finland consistently ranks as the happiest country despite having a lower GNI than some richer nations. So yeah, the Scandinavians are like famously happy people, despite sort of potentially having low GNI. And the third sort of alternative measure of economic well-being includes the Happy Planet Index. Measures well-being based on life expectancy, measures well-being based on life expectancy, well-being, inequality, and ecological footprint. For example, Costa Rica scores highly due to high life satisfaction and sustainability despite a modest GNI. Okay, and to finish off, we need some real world examples because that is, well, country. The question specifically asks us for that. So we need a few real world examples of where GNI works, where it kind of works, and perhaps where it doesn't really work that well at all. All right. So in the first category of sort of where GNI is quite useful, where it's done its job properly. Countries such as Norway and Switzerland have high GNI per capita, which corresponds to strong healthcare, education, and quality of life. Then, in the not always useful category, we've got things like resource rich countries, like Saudi Arabia, for example. Saudi Arabia has high GNI due to oil wealth, but economic well being is unevenly distributed. Third category of, or third example of where GNI kind of has not really been that useful is where we have an overlooked informal economy. So countries like India, where they've got a lot of informal production and those sort of other things that don't really get captured in GNI. In countries such as India and Nigeria, GNI underestimates economic contributions due to large informal sectors. And in the last category, we've got countries that have high happiness despite low GNI. So an example of like Costa Rica. Costa Rica has moderate GNI, but high well-being due to sustainability and strong social support. All right, made it there in the end. Okay, so to summarize, GNI is a useful but incomplete measure of economic well-being. While it provides insights into income levels and growth, it does not capture inequality, externalities, or non-monetary factors that affect quality of life. Alternative measures such as the OECD Better Life Index and Happiness Index provide a broader view of well-being. Policymakers should consider multiple indicators to gain a more accurate picture of economic prosperity and social progress. And there you have it. So I think that kind of does this nicely. So just let's just quickly summarize. The question asked us to use some real world examples to discuss whether GNI is a useful measure of economic well-being. So we started off by defining a couple of key terms, that being GNI, obviously, and there's that of economic well-being. Don't really need a diagram for this one because I can't really see how a diagram would work. But yeah, so we did spend quite a bit of time explaining sort of how GNI works and where it doesn't really work. So when it works, is that it captures things like high GNI or high incomes, capture things like high standard of living. But what it can overlook is that it can overlook things like income and wealth distribution, externalities, whether there's any sort of informal, unpaid work, as well as composition of output, what the stuff and things that your country is making, as well as any sort of natural resource depletion that might be taking place. We also went ahead and proposed some alternative measures of economic well-being, things like the OECD Better Life Index, World Happiness Index, and the Happy Planet Index, and sort of finished off by looking at some real-world examples of where GNI has been useful or perhaps not as useful. And yeah, I think that's probably a pretty well-rounded solution. I hope that was useful, and I'll do the third and final question in the next video. All right, thanks guys. See you next time.